Good afternoon, everyone. We are now entering the micro, or as they would say, booth, the case study part of this conference. The panels before us were focused on waterfront issues. The next two are going to cover specific companies. The one after us is on Facebook. This one is on Google. I guess I should start with my own disclosure, which is that I did much of my prep work for this by exchanging emails with my panelists over Gmail. I supplemented that by Googling articles, and I used Google Maps to get here. Now, before we get to the panel, it's my job here to set the table. As you all surely know, there has been a lot of legal and legislative activity on Google over the past couple of years in the US, Europe, and around the world. In this country, there are now 3 main lawsuits accusing the Alphabet subsidiary of abusing its market power. The first filed in October 2020 by the Trump Justice Department, joined initially by 11 states, which claims that Google has used anti-competitive tactics to protect its monopoly power over general search. That's tentatively set for trial in September 2023. That complaint was followed by 2 state-led lawsuits, one by Colorado and Nebraska, which also looks at general search, but extends that to saying that the company has used its dominance over general search to constrain vertical search on services such as Yelp and Kayak. The other suit, led by Texas, is focused on digital advertising. Meantime, as we heard from Representative Ken Buck last night, there are moves, bipartisan moves in Congress for some kind of legislation that could move, at least in his optimistic view, as soon as this year. I should note that Google has denied all the allegations in the lawsuits and is contesting them. Europe has been ahead of the US in legal cases, fines, and now with an ambitious Digital Markets Act trying to force the opening up of the search system. So the mission of this panel is to do a deeper dive on the issues around Google, looking at 4 main questions. First, what are the theories of harm, and are they solid? Second, what does an ideal remedy actually look like? Third, what is the best way to get there? Antitrust, legislation, regulation, or some combination? And fourth, what are the risks and potential downsides of those actions? Here's how we will proceed. Our leadoff hitter is Steve Tadelis, down at the very far end, who will provide an overview of Google's evolution and how we got to this place. Steve is professor of economics and Sarin Chair in Leadership and Strategy at the University of California's Berkeley Haas School. His research primarily revolves around e-commerce and the economics of the internet, and he has, over the past decade, taken leaves of absence to work at both Amazon and eBay. Steve will be followed by Christina Cafara, who will give us the lay of the land of what has been happening in Europe and her take on the effectiveness of that. Christina is a senior consultant to Charles River Associates based in London and Brussels. She's also an economist, but a rare one whom Matt Stoller approves of. She has worked on a number of landmark antitrust and competition cases before the European Commission and around the world, and has been an advisor to the previously mentioned Texas and Colorado state-led cases. Then we're going to hear from Sarah Miller, who will discuss the evolving politics and policy landscape in the US. Sarah is executive director and founder of the Washington-based American Economic Liberties Project, which describes itself as a hub for anti-monopoly expertise and advocacy. She was on the Biden administration's transition team and an advisor to the Obama Treasury. And lastly, but not leastly, Randy Picker will provide what we could say perhaps is a nod to the old-fashioned fairness doctrine. He will provide perhaps a different perspective on these questions and what he calls a defense of competition and consumers. Randy is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Law at Chicago, and he has a degree in economics. At one point in his career, he clerked for Judge Richard Posner, a leader of the original Chicago School of Antitrust. And with that, Steve, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jake. First, I will offer my disclosures. So as Jake said, I did work for eBay and Amazon in executive and science roles from 2011 to 2021. I no longer am engaged with either company. I supported the FTC and the Canadian Competition Bureau in some consumer protection cases. I have been engaged to both support and oppose Google on matters that do not directly involve search. And I've also worked on behalf of Facebook. And last but not least, because this is the most fun, I advise some startups on market design. I am an economist, and I thought, this week with Passover, I remembered the Red Sea, and then living in Israel, I was told my neighbors are trying to throw me in the sea, and yesterday I learned that I'm still someone's trying to throw me into the sea. So luckily, I don't think he's here, so maybe I'm safe for the next hour. So if you think of the history of search, it's I'm probably one of the people here who are old enough to remember when it started. Looking around, I'm sure many of you have grown up in a world where you only know Google, but I remember using Lycos and using Excite. And then one day I got a call from my good friend and former classmate Aviv Nevo saying, have you heard of Google? This was 1998. I said no. He said use them to search, and lo and behold, it works like magic. And later I learned about PageRank, which is named after Larry Page, the person who invented it. And of course, it also means that pages are ranked in a way that seem to do better in terms of giving people what they want. And that was a huge innovation. And within just a few years, Google became dominant and remained dominant ever since then, which I think is one of the reasons that we're here. We're having this discussion, and we're getting a lot of attention because we are talking about now close to 20 years of dominance in search. And every so often, I will admit that I do try Bing, and it seems decent, but it always seems to fall short a little bit from my experience. And again, I haven't tried that in probably 6 months, so maybe it's even better today. I will say that there are 2 people I know who use DuckDuckGo regularly because they are very concerned about privacy. But again, even though there's a lot of talk about privacy and the willingness to impose more privacy, people don't seem to choose DuckDuckGo in large numbers. So that's another interesting observation. I believe that DuckDuckGo is powered by Bing. Jake mentioned the woes that Google is experiencing now in terms of antitrust cases. I'm sure Christina will speak more to the EU. I know she will. There was a famous case in the EU in 2017 where Google was slapped with $2.7 billion fine and a remedy of advancing other comparison websites. The whole thing was about preferential treatment, and this is going to be a recurring theme. And in the US, the filings that all happened in late 2020, in October and November, there are 3 cases actually. The one that the DOJ, together with a bunch of states, mostly Republican at the time, has claimed that Google is using anti-competitive conduct or tactics to protect its monopoly over search. And the conduct that I find most interesting to focus on, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this, is the fact that they are the default on many devices, and again, well, I'm sure we're going to say a lot more about that. Another thing that is raised often is, for example, the agreement that Google has with Apple, where Google paid Apple, I think, about $12 billion to be the default on Safari on iPhones. And a second lawsuit filed by Texas and a bunch of states, again, about Google, in this case, controlling big chunks of the advertising funnel. And the claim is that Google hurts advertisers, publishers, and discriminates against rival tech firms. And the arguments often are that Google would earn less if there were more middle brokers in this arena of digital marketing. And then there's also a claim in that lawsuit about a deal between Google and Facebook that allegedly is a violation of Section 1 of the Sherman Act. And I think most of the documents for that are redacted, so I don't know how that's going to shake up. And finally, the third lawsuit that was filed just a day after the Texas lawsuit was filed by a bunch of states, I think close to 30 maybe. It mirrors the DOJ complaint about search, and the new piece in that lawsuit alleges that Google is using its monopoly over general search, which is, you're searching for anything, in order to discriminate against what people refer to as vertical search, say Yelp for restaurants or local activities, or Kayak for travel. Now, as I mentioned, I am an economist, and when I look at these, I'm really looking for conduct that impedes on competition and creates some kind of welfare harm. It could be price, it could be quality, it could be innovation. And I know there's going to be a lot of discussion of other ways in which our democratic process may be harmed, and so on. And you know, I'm going to try to focus on that as this panel evolves on what are the potential economic harms and how one might think about that. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Sarah, over to you. Or I'm sorry, Christina, sorry.
Right.
Didn't mean to skip you.
No. Well, thank you, Jake, and let me start thanking Luigi, Filippo, and Guy for this invitation. It's delightful to be here. Starting with disclosures, I have worked adverse to Google for multiple years, both for clients, no longer for clients, but now I do pro bono work for agencies in the main. I worked adverse to Facebook in the last 3 years. I've done work for Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Uber, Microsoft, and more. So I'm the European on this panel, and Jake introduced this by saying Europe has been somewhat ahead. Well, not so fast, right? In that, while I think in chronological order, if you like, in sense of chronology, Europe has been ahead. I think the message of what I'm going to, the message I'm going to leave you with is that this has not been a successful experiment. I think we need to really try and draw lessons from that and inferences. Let me also say that particularly in the wake of the two panels today, there was a very interesting panel, almost everyone here was here this morning, but on the meaning of consumer welfare and what we're trying to do in antitrust, and then a later panel on including discussions about data and advertising. I feel very strongly that the issues here are acute issues of political economy that need to be discussed. In those terms, I very much agree with the framing of Luigi this morning to the discussion. I also think, very importantly, that what I will focus on is mainly antitrust and economic regulation and the experience of that in Europe, but there is a bigger picture that we really need to capture in this panel in some way, which has to do with the fact that the main harms really pertain to violations of data protection and privacy on a massive scale, which are certainly supported by market power. We are in a market power crisis and in a data protection crisis, and the two certainly reinforce one another. So I will talk to mostly the market power issue, but I want to go back to the data protection issue because it is that market power that allows violation of data protection, and in turn, the wholesale violation of data protection rules by market power giants is what enables them to preserve and maintain that power over time. So I think this is the bigger picture that I think we need to go back to. But in terms of the conventional, or the more conventional antitrust and regulatory approach. So Europe has been in some sense ahead. Of course, everybody knows it. Europe has been preening itself for some time about having been the initiator. Cases in Europe against Google go back to 2010, and there's been a handful of decisions. Steve mentioned shopping, but of course we had Android, we had AdSense in the last sort of few years. All of these cases ending up with an infringement decision and a large fine that hit the headlines, and it gave the impression of a certain amount of activism, right? Relative certainly to the US permafrost, the fact that nothing was happening here for 2 decades, Europe appeared to be a hub of activity. So the case is concluded in 2017, 18, 19 with these infringement decisions, big fines, and the reality, though, is that 4 or 5 years after these decisions, we have literally nothing to show for them. The decisions and the enforcement have failed entirely to make change on the ground. And why? Why? Because fundamentally these decisions were about just cease and desist. So you come to an infringement decision and you tell the company, cease and desist, don't do this anymore. There is a very limited direction. They're not settlement decisions. They are really literally stop doing what you're doing. There is a limited direction that says, do not try and do it in a similar way. Don't try and circumvent this. So for example, in shopping, there was some notion that Google needed to treat competing comparison shopping services no less favorably than itself, some notion of non-discrimination over there. In Android, Google should no longer adopt a tie or equivalent measures, again, very general, very high level. And that means in an environment in which there is, of course, huge asymmetry of information, huge scope for the defendant to effectively go away and design the remedy, and then come back to the regulator and say, I've got this idea. Is this okay? The regulator says, oh, let me think about it. I'll kind of market test, 6 months, 8 months, and then the market screams, and they go back and say to Google, no, this won't do. And Google says, oh, let me think about it again. There's no end to this game, which is played in a situation of significant asymmetry of information. So in the end, you end up in a situation in which the remedies are completely failing to do anything. So my view, and I think that of many, is that the substance, the economic substance of these cases in Europe was good. I've heard in the US in the past some sort of condescendence that, oh, you silly European do these silly cases on self-preferencing, what even does that mean? But in reality, the shopping case was a perfectly reasonable economic case on foreclosure, because you have somebody who is an allocator of traffic on the internet, and if traffic is allocated to itself and not to others, others wither and die. The Android case was a good old-fashioned tying case a la Microsoft. So the economic substance was good, but the reality is that the remedies failed dramatically. And so I think that is a sober kind of situation for us in Europe to look at. We have been swanning around 3-4 years ago saying, well, at least we are doing something, right? You're not doing anything over there. But it is fact that this is something that we look upon as a total failure so far. So since then, I think three notable things have happened that are worth mentioning. Clearly, the focus of enforcement on this has shifted strongly to the US, and this is even before the latest change in administration. I met at this conference in 2019 General Peterson, who asked me to get involved in the bipartisan effort that was at the time taking shape, and then bifurcated as between Texas doing ag tech and Nebraska, Colorado doing search. And that was a remarkable, even seen from Europe, it's been a remarkable change that, of course, we'll discuss further. But it is, of course, the case that these complaints are underway, but it will take some time before they come to fruition. It is also the case that because the initiative has shifted so dramatically, Europe is now on the back foot on this, and is actually being prodded to actually kind of do more. But the kind of situation on the ground is not particularly promising now. So somebody mentioned, Fiona I think didn't mention this morning, we have been 10 years too late on all of these cases. Of course we have. You know, every time Google shifted the monopoly from one environment to the next, from desktop to mobile, we were late. We were 10 years too late to do anything. The monopoly shifting to auto, the monopoly shifting to the Internet of Things. We're doing nothing there in Europe for sure, or not much, only the Germans, not the European Commission. And so there is a concern that persists that these cases are continuing to be too late and not effective. It's interesting also that the work, I know this is not a panel on ad tech or Texas, but the work that's been done by the Texas litigation team and Dina and others in Texas identifying, uncovering violations or potential violations such as Jedi Blue has quite galvanized in some sense the European agencies to also look there. When before we were like, knock, knock, can we talk to you? No, we only talk to the federal agencies. We are the European Commission. We don't talk to a state. Who are you? But that said, this is now capturing the attention, and there is possibly some action in the wake of initiative that is coming from the US. The second thing that has happened, and I have three things, so just bear with me. The second thing that has happened in recent time has been the landmark judgment of the General Court on shopping, which I think is something that was eagerly awaited, because without that, the European Commission enforcement in tech was dead. I mean, without that confirmation by the court that the shopping case was sound, the European Commission had nowhere to go. Fortunately, that court confirmed and actually improved even on some of the aspects of the Commission decision, essentially confirming that self-preferencing is a thing. And I know that some lawyers have been saying, oh, they don't say self-preferencing. Well, okay, they say discriminating in favor of themselves. Call it something else, okay? They confirm that you don't need to show necessarily that the counterparty is dead, that there is, it's enough to show that there is quite an elimination or a weakening of competition. Importantly, the court kills completely this rhetoric that Google always has. Oh, the case is not refusal to supply. No one is saying it's refusal to supply. Okay, this is a mischaracterization, it's a straw man, the case is about foreclosure. This is product improvement. No, it is not. Stop hiding behind that. It isn't a product improvement, it is about conduct that effectively forecloses others. So, in principle, the shopping judgment should have strengthened significantly the appetite of the European Commission to pursue other cases waiting in the wing, like local, like others. Whether it is going to do it, I think, is a question mark, because what is happening at the same time, and this is my last point, is that having stared in the face of total failure in antitrust, Europe has actually said, oops, let's pivot to regulation. Let's pivot to ex-ante regulation because antitrust really didn't work. And so now we have the DMA, of which certainly I'm proud. I think it's a great piece of legislation, at least in spirit. But it is intended to be something that effectively is going to be used to deter conduct ex-ante. My concern is that the Commission will, A, find it difficult to enforce it, and B, kick into the long grass every antitrust enforcement case with the excuse, we've now got regulation, we'll deal with that through that. So I think we are possibly in a twilight zone in which actual enforcement of the antitrust type is going to be suspended or done not very much about, and then in the expectation that regulation will kick in, maybe in 2 years, in 3 years, and so on. And so my concern is that we are in a limbo. Although it appears that a lot is happening, in fact, whether these things are going to bite is, to my mind, not at all clear, which gives the companies the opportunity to say, are you talking to me? You know, send me a fax when you want to talk, a telex, right? Because that's the technology, and we'll talk at some point. See you in 2025.
Great. Well, thank you. So since you did say that the locus of action is shifting to the United States, perhaps Sarah can give us a more robust view of what's happening here, or not.
Sure,
Right.
sure. And my disclosures, we like to joke, we're funded by foundations that we are paid by dead monopolists, not live ones, which is far less lucrative, I can assure you. But nevertheless, we persist. So that's my disclosure. Thanks so much for including me, and that was a great summary, Christina. I think kind of to step back a little bit and look at, how lawmakers and regulators are interacting with Google in particular. Two big themes kind of come to mind, and I know it's kind of the conventional wisdom to say, Congress can't do anything, the courts are impossible to traverse, let's kind of throw up our hands and try to figure out some other way forward. Well, I think, it's pretty clear that I think two important kind of things have happened. One is that Google has really educated lawmakers and other kind of policy-making elites as to the harms of monopoly power in a wide variety of ways. And I think those lawmakers have opened the door, as both Jonathan, Doha, and Lena talked about, to new stakeholders crowding in to explain kind of in granular detail how Google's business model, how Google's market power affects them, affects their business, and affects fair competition. And I think we shouldn't kind of underestimate the learning process that has happened over the last 2 or 3 years and how that's affected kind of the political climate. So obviously, in Congress, we're likely, hopefully, to have some legislation move through that the tech industry really would like to see killed and are spending kind of great, significant sums of money to do that, exercising their political power in really obvious ways. It was inconceivable, I think, particularly to tech lobbyists, et cetera, that Lena Khan would become chair of the Federal Trade Commission. I assume some lobbyists were fired as part of that process. But nonetheless, I think we keep being surprised about how quickly the political landscape is evolving, and things that were previously seen as impossible, in fact, being possible. Obviously, we kind of ran through the main kind of federal antitrust cases against Google. And I think the DOJ was being very strategic and mirroring in some ways its initial case off of the Microsoft case as a way to kind of ease back in to prosecuting monopoly cases. And I think that, some of the things that have been uncovered in the other cases, I think particularly the case brought by Texas and Jedi Blue, lifts up other opportunities to not only, as Lena spoke about, to cure the harm, deter, and stop the bad practices. It also opens up really looking at how do you hold executives, decision makers accountable so that all of those three boxes are checked. I think it is not lost on any of us who follow this closely that they have all talked about the need for criminal deterrence. And I think that one of the ways you begin to claw back into a place where we can begin to make up for kind of 40 years of a lack of enforcement is to create that aggressive deterrence structure in accordance with the law. So I think there's so many kind of moving pieces. Google is a particular kind of focal point, both because of the variety of ways in which it exercises its market power, the variety of stakeholders, which I think have learned about that in a productive way and are working together. And this is not only true in big tech, we've seen it in other areas of antitrust, very unusual kind of collaborations between lawmakers who rarely work on anything else outside of antitrust. And we've obviously kind of seen it in the enforcers that the Biden administration has put in charge of the agencies. So I think when you have these conditions, this, I think, ability to really kind of learn and think about issues differently. And a lot of people who, from my perspective, who have power in this space, either to make appointments or to kind of set congressional agendas, this antitrust was kind of a dead language. Like, they hadn't thought about it in 40 years. They didn't realize it was a thing, right? And so you have a whole new crop of people with positions of authority who have been able to come in and learn largely through the behavior of the big tech platforms. I think you have a really, in my view, dangerous set of conditions for big tech companies. And, I think they should be, quite worried about what has been, in my view, kind of rampant, blatant law breaking that has simply gone unchecked, right? So I think that's kind of where I see the political moment. And, I don't think there's any universe. And, I think when the COVID pandemic started, our view was like, oh, this is going to really take away from the momentum that we've seen against big tech. It's going to be a real problem. And, really it's only continued to intensify under those conditions. So, that's kind of my overview of where kind of the U.S. political climate sits.
Great, thank you very much. A lot to come back to, but Randy, let's get your perspective.
Thanks. So I don't think I have any meaningful conflicts. I will say one of my kids is interviewing for a job with Google. So I very much hope to have conflicts for a long time. But I'll believe it when I see it. I want to start by talking about competition and monopoly a little bit. I wasn't here yesterday at class, but I got a chance to read Jonathan Cantor's really interesting speech. So I want to start there. And then I want to map all of that to Google and pick up a couple of points that have been made. So when Senator Sherman introduces the Sherman Act in 1890, none of the language that we know of as the Sherman Act is actually in that bill. His language, and he focuses not on single firm activity, and this distinction between joint activity and single firm activity strikes me as critical. He doesn't focus on single firm activity at all. He focuses on joint activity. And he focuses on two things. Things which get in the way of, I'll just quote the language, things that prevent full and free competition. So competition, that's what Cantor talked about yesterday. I agree with him completely on that. And then the second thing, sort of ironically, is things made with a view to, or which tend to advance the cost to the consumer of any such articles. So the original version that Sherman puts in place is very much focused on competition, focused on consumers, and focused on prices, cost as he puts it. None of that language actually makes it into the Sherman Act. Sherman has this bill, it's in the Finance Committee, he loses control, it goes to the Senate Judiciary Committee. And out of that comes completely different language that is now the Sherman Act that we know. Sherman Act that focuses Section 1 on joint activity restraints of trade, and Section 2, single firm activity monopolization. Sherman says, okay, I'm not going to get any better, I'm done. And then there's a back and forth on the floor of the Senate between two senators, Senator Kenna, Senator Edmonds. Edmonds was very much involved in the Judiciary Committee process. The back and forth runs this way. Kenna says, well, look, this new language, monopolization. Now, wait a second. Are you telling me that a firm that goes out and competes and wins and legitimately obtains that position, that firm is going to be condemned as a criminal under Section 2? Senator Edmonds says, no, as I'm sure the gentleman well understands, blah, 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 right? So this distinction up front between things which are either joint activity which gives rise to restraints of trade, things which are illegal activities by people who have monopolies, but people who can earn monopolies and win in the marketplace, and that's not condemned, that's critical in there in the beginning. So Cantor yesterday, he says, look, he goes to his second point, and he suggests, look, it's the technocrats who have somehow managed to create a world in which we both care about competition and have monopolies. And I say, no, at the very beginning, we understood that one of the critical things that might come out of a competitive process is that someone would win. That's a legitimate part of competition, and we have to accept that. All right, now I want to map all of that to Google. So Steve gave some of the history. He talked about Lycos and Excite, I guess. I guess I was an Alta Vista guy. The search market was a competitive market. There were large firms in it. Alta Vista was digital equipment, so a very successful computer firm. Google came in with a better product. That's what happened there. And Google's success there is remarkable. Talk about Android. We'll jump ahead. The phone market was a highly concentrated market. Nokia with its Symbian operating system, RIM with BlackBerry. There was entry in that market in competition. Remarkable change in that market, and there were three different business models. A highly vertically integrated business model that was Apple, a model that Google was running, they bought Android, and in that model what they do is they say, we're going to finance this software on the other side of the market. We're going to bring our advertising skills to bear. And then the third model, which was Microsoft. Microsoft was very much trying to repeat in the smartphone space exactly what it had done in the PC space, which is they sold software to handset makers. Of those three models, one failed. Consumers, Jake said I was going to defend consumers, consumers made a choice. And the choice they made was to love the Apple phones that you see so many of. And obviously there are a huge number of Android phones. But the model that was rejected was the one that effectively the Google Android decision then in the European Union forced Google to move to, a model that was rejected by the marketplace. I'm completely in agreement with Christina that notwithstanding a certain, I love the permafrost language, that's what a good phrase. Love good language, that's great. I completely agree that there's a certain amount of jealousy that you hear in US antitrust circles about, my God, look what the Europeans are able to do. only we were like the Europeans, we'd be better looking, we'd smoke more. But
More style, more style.
more style. Yeah, look at Christina, look at me. I lose that one. Okay. But on the ground, you've accomplished nothing. And that's what you said. And it's completely right. So that's a failed process. And so we're now at this next stage. And the next stage, and I've got maybe one more minute, this next stage is a question. The U.S. antitrust system is a system based on fault. We can have a lively discussion about, when did Google become evil or not, right? That's a fine discussion. Apple basically died in 1996. It's a company that almost died, right? The resurrection of Apple is a remarkable story. But the fact that these companies maybe have won legitimately doesn't mean we're done with regulation. That's the point we're at, right? We've got many tools. I'm teaching a course right now on platforms and networks. We're talking about railroads and telegraphs. We regulate natural monopolies. We know the tools to do that. Non-discrimination. We had a non-discrimination remedy in the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887. Non-discrimination is not a new idea. It doesn't mean it's a bad idea at all, but it's a long-term remedy that we've used in these spaces. That's a great conversation to have. I don't think it's an antitrust conversation, but I can wear all those hats, so I don't know that I care about it. But I think we are at this point where we say we've got these companies that have been remarkably successful, and for reasons at their core that I think are legitimate. Now what do we want to do about it?
Great. Well, thank you all for the
Oh,
overview.
dear.
That's right.
Oh, dear.
We
So-
knew we were going to fight.
Yes.
No, that's okay. So I wanted to actually go back to a little bit of the basis. We've spent this time, great overviews, with the premise that there is something that needs to be addressed, but we haven't really defined what that something is. So getting back to one of the primary questions that Filippo asked us to answer, and if we could maybe do it like in a minute or two just down the line, what is the theory of harm here? What is it that needs to be addressed? And it could be multiple things, but go down your checklist.
Well, it is a pattern of different conducts. This is the main thing. There are multiple conducts that extend to tying, to exclusive dealing, to redirection of traffic, to degradation of others' positioning on the page, you name it. There is illegal agreements. So there is an endless list of conducts. There's tie, there's bundling. So in fact, what is at stake here is the ability to perform and to engage in multiple conducts that extend, protect, develop the monopoly into more domains. This is the problem.
And just to follow up on that, the harm from those illegal actions has been what in your mind?
Loss of competition. The competition is dead. 90% in search is Google. Now, I know Randy goes back to a bucolic past in which they were wonderful and they were good and they meant well and they were the best product. Of course they were the best product, but they were for a while, and then you end up doing bad stuff to protect your
Do you have a
position.
date? When did they?
No,
when
I
did
don't
they-
All right. Well, so
Okay.
Randy, what is your? I mean, even you were saying we have to do something. I mean, you were
I
suggesting.
didn't say that.
Well, you were implying that there
I
was-
said it was a moment where
Okay,
we're
it was
going
one.
to have this
So
conversation.
do you think there is any theory of harm to Google? At this
Look,
point?
I've said this before. I've said this at this conference. If you'd put me in DOJ, I would have been happy to run with a vertical search tying case, a la Microsoft, in that era.
Yeah.
I don't think that's
Android.
the I don't think that's the Android story. That's what I think is different. So the time that occurs in the Microsoft situation. I'll go back classic.
Make sure you
Microsoft.
speak in the microphone. there,
Sorry. The time that goes. I don't want to just talk. So.
No.
No, but there are people online.
Okay, so the time that goes on in the Microsoft situation is at a point where Microsoft faces its first threat. Of course, and this is Netscape. They don't actually lose the time there, just so we're clear. That doesn't work out that way. The DC Circuit 7-0 remains that below, and that case gets settled. They lose in the monopoly maintenance. But the time there was in the face of a threat. Android is a situation where Google says we are competing in a smartphone marketplace where we have a 0% market share. We think this is a good business model. The market said that was right.
I'll go back to that.
That's
Okay,
fine.
well, come in. Sarah, how would you like to expand on or echo any of those harms?
Well, we tend to agree with Christina. I think you could have the whole panel kind of talking about the range of harms that Google and other tech platforms.
So one thing I
impose.
don't want to put words in your mouth, but I wondered if you would expand it from. And Christina talked about use of monopoly power in the business context, but I wondered whether you would veer into some of the things that we talked about this morning on sort of political concerns with that power as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really came through from the House Antitrust Subcommittee report on this was just how many businesses couldn't come forward to talk about the harms that they experience at the hands of Google and other tech platforms. And that's something that I think is systemic across the economy in areas where there are concentrated markets, that imposition of limits on your ability to speak freely, and not just to speak freely, to go kind of talk privately to lawmakers, because that information might come back to a Google lobbyist, and that might affect, you know, your livelihood, right? So I think when you can talk about a whole range of ways that Google kind of creatively can steal from competitors or steal from consumers, or steal from kind of other market participants. And I think when you look at the need to reestablish competition, that inherently means ensuring that these other market participants have some level of market power, which I think in the case of a lot of the businesses who are running up against Google is clearly not the case. But you know, that's kind of the fundamental question here, is that Google has been able to amass an amount of market and political power that has a significant amount of control over you know, the livelihoods of many, many Americans who depend on Google to kind of reach their customers, and haven't had any recourse. And if they do seek recourse, are justifiably kind of afraid of retaliation, in which there is no ability to seek any sort of justice or restitution. So I think that that's really indicative of a characteristic of the economy that is broadly systemic, and it is a headwind against being able to solve it. And this is something we hear all the time from people in all sorts of different sectors, like, please don't let anyone know we're talking to you, right? And I think that is something that we have to remember.
Steve, do you want to add in any other further on the theories of harm?
Well, yeah, on the theories of harm, the way I see it, right, price, quality, innovation, right? Those are the things that, as an economist, I will focus on, and I will ignore other things for which I have no expertise to say. And one of the things that concerns me in the broader debate around big tech, and not just Google, is that you have people coming with very different mindset and agendas, and kind of, you know, going off of something that Randy said when he referred to his son and Google possibly getting a job. You said, you know, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yes.
I think that in many of
he's not
these,
listening.
no, but I think in many of these issues, a lot of people are coming to the debate with the mindset of, I'll see it when I believe it. And I think that is, you know, somewhat of a concern, right? Now, when I think directly about the harm, right? So let's take steering, for example, right? Or self-preferencing. That is conduct that could indeed be anti-competitive, right? It could harm the competition, the competitive process. And, you know, the EU case was an example. And when I look at these things, I say, okay, I understand that. I understand the theory of harm. And now the question is the steering, right, the self-preferencing, doing one of two things? Is it directing to lower quality? Because let's remember, when it comes to prices, on the user side, the prices are always zero, right? And if people want to talk about, no, you're paying with your data, well, that's a whole different can of worms. So let's put that can of worms aside. So if I'm steered to a lower quality product, that is anti-competitive and that is harm. But what happens if I'm actually steered to a better product, right? I don't know, right? The devil is in the details. Now, from things that I see, I think there's probably a little bit of both. And how do we identify when it is harmful and when it is not? And it could be that there's enough of a concern of the harm to say, you know what, we won't go into the details of how harmful it is. There's a potential for harm here. We're going to shut this down. You count self-preference. That's a fine decision. It is going to have some type 1 and type 2 errors. You know, the other one is the, you know, the notion of tying that Christina referenced. You know, when you're paying someone to use your product, the question is, again, is there an efficiency gain or an efficiency loss and some kind of harm in innovation? It's clear that early on, Google arrived where it arrived based on the quality. Now, a lot of people are just using it as default. And we know that that is giving them a comparative advantage with more and more data. The question again is there room for more innovation? Possibly, that's where I'd like to see the argument happening as far as harm goes.
So Christina has been sending me very subtle signals that she
No,
wants,
at some
she wants to
point
weigh in.
I jump out of my skin and I will do things. So I mean, let me just be clear on one thing. The fact that I've been saying that in Europe we failed to actually produce results isn't at all a justification, or it isn't to say that the cases went good. I said it very clearly. The failure has been entirely in the remedies. The remedies have failed. And we can discuss why. But the cases were good. They were solid. There are 400 pages of a European Commission decision. Shopping is now confirmed by the General Court. Android is about, we are going to get a judgment imminently. The point is, we are not at the beginning of time, guys. We are not here thinking, oh, maybe there was an efficiency there. Did we all miss it? No, we've been at it for 10 years. There wasn't. We've done decisions that kind of show that they were there killing the competition. The comparison shopping industry, which I don't particularly care about. I don't give a damn about comparison shopping. I don't care, but they were still killed. And that is killing competition. I don't know what amount of innovation could have eventuated if they had not monopolized that space through conduct that is not just self-preferencing, because remember, it isn't just the fact that they had their own box where everything was directed. They were found by the European Commission to have actively degraded the position of others. So that's, there's 400 pages of that. Read it. The court agrees with it. And so I think that's not an issue. The tie. Well, I mean, what are we here to protect? Steve, you talk about price, quality, and innovation. Of course, but you need competition for that. And if you adopt conduct that closes every conceivable hatch to competition, then you're not going to have quality improvement or innovation because no one can compete. So in the Android case, what happened was that Google said, oh, we need to move, the monopoly, we need to move effectively to mobile because the desktop is not where we want to be anymore, or not only. We need a mobile. So how are we going to adopt, how are we going to implement that shift? By going to every OEM and saying, if you agree to put Google search as the default at every single point of entry in the device, then you can have Google Play Store for free. And you're going to have also revenue share. No one could make a better offer. Now, of course, Randy, you say this is their business model. They were exploiting their business model. Fine. It is a business model I have serious problems with, too, because it is the business model, the ad-funded business model, that has led us to the emergency we have today with tracking of advertising, with data protection violations. So I think there are big questions on that business model. And I don't want to hear that this is not antitrust. Well, so we're going to silo everything, and we're going to say, oh, this is antitrust. We just do market power over here. And data protection is having nothing to do with us. Let the privacy people deal with it. Nothing to do with we can't. I mean, the data protection crisis we're in now is a product of this business model. Hello. So I don't think we can ignore this fact. Yes, we do antitrust, but we need to have a little bit of a vision. So I think it is the case that Europe, and I repeat, has failed to drive change on the ground. Why? Because we told them, don't do it again, bad dog, don't do it again, okay? But in fact, they all went and said, okay, and then went out and ran back from the back door and did it again because they're smarter than the regulator, right? And that's what happens. So on the time case, in Android, the issue was, don't tie again. They said, okay, we don't tie. Now we got a new system. If you want Google search, if you want the Google Play Store, you pay 100. But if you want to actually put search as a default in every entry point, you get a discount of 100. Okay, so that's a tie. Okay, so the remedy failed, and everyone else, that's a nice way to think about it. Very clever. And then they realize, oh, gee, we're being screwed. But in fact, it isn't the case. It is that the reason why these remedies in the end. Now we've ended up after 3 years with a system in which we have a choice screen. So everybody needs to pay money to Google to appear on that choice screen.
Okay, so let's pivot, since you've talked about the remedies, to that question, which is to use Luigi's formation of queen for a day, or king for a day.
I'm ready. I'm ready. Other queen, as Politico said. There you go.
Queen of the United States for a day.
Oh, no, competition.
It's hard to compete with that. What would you do? And let's maybe start at the other end of the table. We can come back to you again, give you some more
I'll
time.
shut up for a while.
But so, I mean, what if you were king for the day and could displace Christina for a little while? What do you think would be appropriate policies of any kind that would fix whatever you consider to be the concerns about Google?
I will refrain from accepting the position of king for the day. It's not something I feel comfortable doing because being trained as a scholar, right, I like digging into details. I like doing trade-off comparisons. I like understanding what the objective is. So if someone tells me the objective is to save democracy, and here's evidence how our democracy is eroded, I'm like, okay, we're going to pay with efficiency and some other things to solve that. So I'm going to take the role of bureaucrat. Tell me what you want, and I'll try to
So
put
let's say
together
that you want more competition in search.
If one wants more competition in search, let's take, for example, what we've seen in the EU case, right, that Christina mentioned. So my understanding now, and Christina is much more knowledgeable about the details, is that the remedy was you have to have choice. You know, do you want Google? Do you want Bing? Do you want, I don't know what the others are, DuckDuckGo, and so on. I heard that most people tend to choose Google, right? Now, could it be that if there was more robust quality to Bing, more people would have chosen Bing, right? It could be. And now the question then is, where are the benefits going to come from, right? So again, on the user side, the only thing I care about is reaching where I want to go, right? So if that kind of competition would push things even further in terms of the quality of search, then that would be great. I don't know if that will happen, right? So when you're telling me the goal is to have more competition in search, right? I want the goal to be, how do I get higher quality, lower prices, more innovation, right? And I could see how these kind of tying contracts would indeed put barriers to innovation, right? And that's the kind of conduct I would look at with more detail, with more scrutiny, and indeed may even reach the conclusion, yes, this should be disallowed because this hampers the kind of innovation that I would like to see happen.
But if you read the Commission's decision, that's exactly what they do for 500 pages.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Sarah?
I think you have to think about the answer to this question in the context of what Google is, which is this, massively powerful conglomerate at this point. And, just listening to Randy's remarks, obviously Google, Facebook, these tech platforms came to exist in a certain regulatory environment that facilitated this type of business model, the type of business model that they operate, and this type of size, scope, and structure. So I think that we have to kind of make sure that we are positing Google in this particular context, right? We helped to create Google by changing the way that we enforce our antitrust laws, by changing the way that we prosecuted regulatory interventions, and therefore Google exists as it does today. I think any remedy has to take into account basically what Christina was saying, which is the fact that they have the ability, the power, the audacity to ignore it and say, what are you going to do about it, right? Wait for a political change, run out the clock, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why we really kind of try to focus on remedies that can get at the underlying power of a political institution like Google, or can kind of dramatically serve as a deterrent for this type of anti-competitive conduct. So breakups, I think we all kind of agree that Facebook and Google operate on a really unsustainable, problematic business model from a variety of standpoints, and real deterrence through the enforcement of the law and holding kind of personal executives accountable if they break it. And this is all something that is incredibly new. We have not been doing this for a generation or more, but I think those are the pillars of a sustainable solution to a problem like Google's market power and the competitive harms that that creates.
Randy, I know that you say there may not be a problem to solve, but if there were a remedy, what would you think makes sense?
Yeah, sure. So look, if you made me king for the day, honestly, I'm not going to spend much of the day on antitrust. So I'll just be honest about that. I got a list. We'll go through that. Look, this class I'm teaching right now on platforms and networks. I teach the 1996 Telecommunications Act in the United States. That's a statute that, if I'd been there, some days I'm a smart guy. Maybe you guys think otherwise. But and I go, oh, I understand how smart people could have thought that was intelligent market engineering. Okay, and it was sort of a bust. What I would do here, right, and you know, Christina can talk about this, is I would say, look, there's a decent chance that search is a natural monopoly. You get the data, you learn from the data, you get the data, you learn from the data. That's the kind of cycle that builds on that. So I look at that and go, the solution is to create a commons in that data. Now, that's what the DMA, I think, wants to do. So I haven't seen the current version. I taught the original version 2 years ago, I guess. So, but that was certainly the contemplation there. And sitting here now, I go, I get how you could do that, right? But I also go and say, look at the lessons of that kind of access regime with regard to the telecommunications networks in 1996. The scope, the pricing, we fought for a decade over that, and then it turned out we'd all switch to wireless. Christina, we had a prep call, I hope I can do this, I wrote down the phrase, I abbreviated it as SFN. And the SFN, do you remember this? She said the DMA was a shit show for nothing. And the idea there was, and she's already said this, is it looks pretty good on paper, and I get, to answer your question, conceptually, why you might do this on search on paper. Can you implement it? And you sort of said, maybe not.
So you have laid the table saying Europe has failed at everything it's done. The
At
enforcement
antitrust. So
right.
far.
That the cases taken didn't lead to anything. You have great skepticism about the DMA. So what, if anything, do you consider, if now that you are queen of competition, what is your edict?
Look, I think that it isn't all lost in the sense that I think there should be, I don't see much prospect of it, but antitrust should be powered up at the level of member states. I have more faith in the member states, the CMA, the German authority, the French authority, doing actual cases. They're being left out of the DMA. They're going to continue to do enforcement on their own. Remember, we heard Bill Kovacic talk about the CMA as being an excellent agency. They've, of course, come out of the umbrella of the European Commission recently. In a very short period of time, they've actually built a reputation for extreme activism in sort of this space. And so I think that the CMA will pursue, the Germans will certainly very seriously pursue, and so will the French. It is the European Commission that is caught between this idea that you can do more antitrust cases, but why when you really have at the moment in your lap this big thing, which is the DMA. The DMA doesn't need to be a shit show, but it does...
For nothing.
For nothing.
For nothing.
No,
Exactly.
and the
It could be for
reason
something, yeah.
it is good. Look at the GDPR. Okay, GDPR is an absolutely excellent data protection law, which is not enforced because there is a failure of institutional design. It was badly designed as a law in the sense that implementation has been left to the 27 member states, in fact, to the regions of Germany. So you have 35 data protection agencies in Europe fighting the monopolies with plastic knives. Because when you are the data protection agency of Slovenia and you're up against Google or Facebook, what exactly do you do? So that is a failed model. So the problem is the law is good. The DMA, you read it, is very well, I mean, a lot of companies hate it. But I think that the principles of fairness, contestability, interoperability, all sorts of principles in there are legitimate. The question is, how is it going to be implemented? When the resources aren't there, there is going to be a lengthy delay, and every company is going to look the other way and say, I don't get this.
Well, let me try and boil it down to a more simple question. In your ideal world, what would Google look like after an effective remedy had been imposed?
Well, I think that what we need to look at is certainly a conflict of interest that exists with multiple pieces of the Google business. The most obvious one is ad tech, and we've had discussions around, of this even in this conference. It is a known fact that there are conflicts of interest that need somehow to be dealt with. There are exclusivity contracts that exist between Google and platforms that I think are problematic. They're forms of naked exclusion. There are multiple actions that can be taken. Certainly no self-preferencing is also one. Data processing a la GDPR is also something that really needs to be pursued, because if you are in a world in which you are told, and this is enforced, that you cannot continue to use the data without, for multiple purposes, without consent, this is quite important to the business model. So I think that and you know, I'm personally thinking that breakups in various places might be perfectly reasonable.
In terms of process, you used the phrase about the pivot to regulation from antitrust. And so I'd be curious to get a perspective from folks here whether they feel that regulation, in fact, in the end is a better model to deal with something like Google than antitrust, or some combination, or it depends. So start with you again, Steve, at the end there. It depends.
Being an economist, you know that the answer is going to be it depends, right?
Right.
And again, I think we have to go back to the objectives. If, for example, let's take the role of data in search, okay? And again, I'm constantly thinking about comments that came about how economists are always on one side and then on the other side, and of course that muddles the debate, especially for people who are not well versed enough in the technical details. But if, for example, the belief is that Google's advantage is now self-perpetuating because they have so much traffic, they have so much action, that will give them a comparative advantage that no one else will have. How could we level the playing field to allow, for example, startups to build technology that will help them catch up, okay? At the same time, Google also invested tons and tons of money into creating the infrastructure to allow them to collect the data, so what would be a fair compensation? So some way in which you could think of regulation that carves out little sandboxes of data that could help startups, say, invest in alternative, ways of search, and somehow compensate Google for the fact that they did invest a lot. Or maybe you might say, no, you actually made enough money, and now let's carve out some data and let some VCs throw a bunch of startups at them. That could be a regulation that I wouldn't have a problem with, because Google still has the advantage they have, but you're not putting a huge barrier on innovation. So I'm throwing that out as an example.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think you obviously need both. I don't think it's possible to regulate Google without changing Google's size and structure and political power. And I think even for search, we talk about whether search should be a natural monopoly. I think when you are kind of the gateway to information for billions of people, essentially, that's a really dangerous prospect, to say there's kind of one gateway to the internet, and we're going to be able to kind of regulate that to make sure that it is somehow fair, right? I think we already have a big problem where Google is biasing its own properties and creating a walled garden. There's certainly been instances of, articles disappearing and YouTube videos being blocked, and there's a whole content moderation question that then kind of goes into that, right? That both gets at a question of, well, who's deciding who sees what, and how is that influenced by advertising dollars or political views, that makes kind of concentrating a gateway to kind of knowledge in perpetuity, supposedly policed fairly by the government, a kind of dangerous idea. So I think the need for both, obviously, regulation, since there are many reasons why that should be the case, but also fundamentally for changing the amount of political power and economic power that Google has, by eliminating these conflicts of interest in the first place, by making Google something that regulators can actually understand, right? And it doesn't feel like it has this unaccountable level of political power across a wide variety of economic spheres is kind of philosophically a fundamental point of how we approach a problem like Google. So you obviously, I think, need both. This regulated competition approach, I think, is particularly important just in the context, like I said, of the lack of either for so long. It's not an either or, it's a both, and hopefully both of those avenues continue to kind of move forward, and maybe the EU can catch up.
Well, it seems to me that on this panel, I mean, Randy and Steve, you really are answering the questions in a narrow, real economist way. So is the price, the variety, and the innovation. And I think what we are saying is that there is also a broader concern about economic powers that begets political power. And that is where Sarah is coming from. I have sympathy for that view. And I don't think one can discount it, because it is a view that is now quite diffuse. And it is a view that is now one that we hear from John Cante, from Lina Khan, and it is pervasive. In Europe, it is also a concern that is there. So I think one cannot limit the discussion to, are we going to do something narrowly about economic regulation? There is a bigger piece that also needs to be taken into account, which is a product also of the business model. I do agree with you, Steve, when you say, well, you know what, they're not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere. In the same ways, and this is the reason why fundamentally I think the regulation isn't going to do, even this regulation, the DMA isn't going to do much. Apple isn't going anywhere. Amazon isn't going anywhere. Google isn't going anywhere. So how are we going to see some competition? Are we going to facilitate some entry? Because these guys aren't going to just shrink. That is my view. And so I don't think that sandboxing some data is going to do it. But I think the real difficult regulatory question is, how do you actually create the conditions for perhaps in the future to see some challenges, competitive challenges? Because I think that even the regulation isn't going to take us to the place we need to be.
Randy, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I guess I want to go back a little bit to what Sarah said, and then I'll go to what Christina said. So and I guess I'll do a little history. So, we reached a point with AT&T, the FCC, which had, pretty full tilt regulatory authority. And they said, they're too complicated, they're too big, we can't regulate them. And so the FCC had sort of, thrown up its hands, and that's when we brought the 1974 antitrust action. That's the one that resulted in the breakup of AT&T, which is our last great breakup. Now, it's critical to see a couple points about that, to see how that then maps back to Google. And AT&T, man, they were, they were everywhere. And so the government, when back in the 50s when AT&T's getting sued, the Attorney General's chasing them. DOD's saying to the Attorney General, what are you doing? We need them for national defense. So the extent of their power was dramatic. Okay. What happened then, of course, is once we brought the 74 suit is AT&T agreed to a breakup. Agreed. We didn't force it upon them, but they agreed. But part of that was because they wanted something. And they wanted to get free of the 1956 final judgment, Enter Computers. We don't have a pre-existing regulatory regime for Google. It's not clear to me what Google wants. So the political will that it would take to do this strikes me as high. It seems easier to do it in Europe than it does in the United States. I don't think I'm a political will expert.
Okay. And then lastly, before we turn it over to the audience, what, if at all, do you think are the risks to overreach? Randy, in reading one of the articles you sent me, you warned, this was, I guess one of the remedies going through the House, you talked about, I like this phrase, a Thanos snap for our daily digital lives.
See, even I can do words.
As large parts of what we are used to would vanish before our very eyes. And as I had sort of started out by saying, I understand all the arguments how I'm being harmed by Google, but I also know that I'm dependent on them for email, for search, for finding my way around the city, and whatever solutions, I don't want that to be messed up. So are there risks to overreach, and what are they, and how does one mitigate those? And whoever wants to go first.
You go.
No.
No. I'm happy to go, but I'm happy to listen.
If she wants you to go first.
That's fine. I'll look, here's the issue, it seems to me, and again, I'll point to Europe. So Europe has engaged in this kind of product design multiple times. They did it twice in the Microsoft era. the version of Windows XP with the media player, the version without the media player. They did it famously with regard to the ballot choice screen for Windows 7. All of that market engineering, I think, again, with Christina, accomplished nothing. That's true on the Android choice screen. One possibility here is that when we turn on our smartphones, be it an Android or an iPhone, we will be presented with a bevy of choice screens. That's what we will see as our user experience. And so consumers have said they like these products, and I'm not saying they're perfect at all. And I've tried to indicate ways in which I would go at them. But I'm not hearing a lot of discussion of the consumer experience.
The DMA includes the consumer the choice screen as one of the rules that they introduce. I mean, to the point Steve made before, even now, there is a choice of search engines as a result of the Android remedy. Everybody goes for Google. Yes, but we know from behavioral economics that if you are a super dominant platform, everyone will always, by inertia, tend to go to the number one in the list or to the one that is the biggest, right? So and if the others are tiny, it's not surprising, let's put it this way, that it doesn't really change the relative shares. This kind of stuff worked, this is anathema, but worked in Russia, where you actually had a much more even position as between Yandex and Google, and so a choice screen actually allowed Yandex to preserve its kind of share. But in a situation in which you have enormous asymmetry and somebody's down here, you can put a choice screen, but there's going to be always the weirdos who choose that go or the one that no one wants.
The EU should force entire countries to have to use Bing, right? Take all of France and make them use Bing. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, well,
Let's here, sir.
I think when you say the word overreach, that could mean a couple of different things. And just kind of looking at the politics of the moment, we've seen the big tech platforms basically engage in a lot of scare tactics with the constituencies that are dependent on their products. So, if you're a small business that uses Amazon, these bills or antitrust action is going to eliminate your ability to transact on Amazon in some way or impose some cost directly on you. Same for Google, right? You see that these kind of proliferation of scare tactics that rely in the first place on the lack of choice between a seller, a third-party seller, a consumer, right? And so I think that just reinforces, again, the political need for those market participants to have choices when they are engaging in an online marketplace. I think, on Amazon last year, a few years ago, just to give another example, because of their ability to absorb losses for political projects, France tried to regulate warehouse safety in the context of COVID, and they said, okay, we'll just stop operating in France for a week or something. How will that work? And so I think that is really, really dangerous, and that sort of artificial, claim that any sort of regulation, any sort of antitrust enforcement, it's not really going to hurt us, but it's going to hurt you. And then the ability to actually make good on that claim is really frightening. And I think we've started to see some of that, certainly in the rhetoric. And then in a few instances, we've seen some of that actually play out in reality. But I imagine that that's something that should kind of worry, political officials who are kind of going up against these massive, very sophisticated, at least in theory, although sometimes they are fairly clumsy, political operations.
Just as a final point, because I didn't answer the question about overreach. Look, I hear it, and I can see that from their perspective, and I think it is not illegitimate as a concern. You don't want the government to design your product. That is legitimate, because the government cannot design your product. That said, that rhetoric, which is always, be careful, because this is going to hurt you, because this, but China is, I hear about China every 5 minutes, and it is not persuasive. It is not going anywhere. This kind of overreach lobbying in Brussels has totally failed because everyone got tuned out. Okay, so I'm not minimizing the issue. I think there is a question of yes, product design is tricky, and you don't want the government to tell you what to put in your product. That is a legitimate concern. But at the same time, this idea that it's from the Microsoft era. I was working on Microsoft, and at the time we were hearing, but if you touch us, innovation will die. It didn't. And so I don't think it is.
One last quick thing before we turn it over to the...
I don't have really much to add. I think that indeed innovation is the biggest risk here. Now, am I super concerned about that? No, not too much, because when I look at the way the world looks today, I keep seeing more and more evidence that we are on a fast pace towards WALL-E, if you've seen that child's movie, where everybody is interacting through a screen and weighs about 400 pounds. So, you know, I think the social benefits of a lot of these online activities are still not clear.
Okay, thank you all very much. We're now going to turn it over to Kings and Gallus for the first question.
Actually, I have a question for Steve, and I appreciate the fact that you want evidence and so on and so forth, but you know better than I do that there is plenty of evidence that ranking by Google affects outcomes, okay? And we heard today that from a prominent political scientist that this is dangerous for democracy. It's basically a loaded gun, and is dangerous, something should be done. So I reappoint you king for the day, giving you this piece of information. I also remind you that Dante put the inferno to hell, the Pope that actually give up the papacy because he didn't want to choose, okay? So you're not allowed to do that. And I want to know what you're going to do with that, okay? So
You've been put in one of the fires, rings of hell, so go for it.
You know, you asked, let me make sure I understand the question, okay? So do I agree that Google's ranking affects what people click on? Absolutely. There is tons of evidence from information retrieval, computer science, that shows that, you know, it's kind of exponential, right? Like most things in life. So absolutely true. Now, the question then becomes, when Google is choosing how to rank things, what is in their objective function? Okay?
no, sorry. The very fact that they can do that
Yes.
is a threat to democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Sorry. The very fact that Google can do that is a threat to democracy, because even if they don't do it, you understand out of equilibrium threats. Mm-hmm. So I am a member of Congress, and I know that unless I am Elizabeth Warren, where in Massachusetts you must be kind of an idiot if you're a Democrat not to be elected. But in most human beings that actually face competition, speaking of competition, they know that there is a risk that Google might rank them down if they go after Google. And so the very threat works even without implementation. I'm not saying that Google has ever exercised this threat, but the existence is a threat to democracy, exactly like Francis Fukuyama said. Is a loaded gun, you don't know who's going to use it.
Okay, so then if I take that a step further, the existence of search that is run by any entity that could control the ranking, the existence of social media that is run by any entity that can control content, is a risk to the democracy.
Yes, if there's huge amounts
No,
of
the existence of a monopolist in
Exactly.
that is a threat. Not the existence of search. It's just saying the existence of newspapers is a threat to democracy. No, but if there is only the Pravda, that's a threat to democracy. Yes.
Okay. So in that case, you know, force people in a random way to use Bing and Google. You get born, you get a social security number. If it ends with an odd number, you have to use Google. And if it ends with an even number, you have to use Bing. Problem solved.
That's your best recipe?
Do you have a better one? Okay, we'll talk about it
Fiona
later.
wanted to say
I
something.
think
Fiona has a-
Fiona said,
I was hoping that this panel was going to be bursting with good ideas, but I'm afraid that they're a little thin on the ground. So here's one that I think is fairly simple and would solve a lot of the problems, not on the ad tech side, but on the search side. And that is to require the divestiture of Android into a separate corporation with a regulated price for the operating system that was a linear tariff, you know, $10 a head, as much as you want to buy. No tying, no special deals, no nothing. And Android would have to be, for those of you in the weeds, not just the Android open source project, but full functional Android. So that means what's in Google Play as well as what's in Android. So you just divest that. And the reason that that would be helpful is because if you're an OEM, You cannot come to market without an operating system, and there's only one for you to license. So you can try to put in place behavioral remedies, as the Europeans have done for 10 years, but that I just charge $100 for this and give a $100 discount, and that's a game that's whack-a-mole and never ends. But if the ability to get an operating system is available to anybody at whatever their scale, and you run it, and there's enough money there to continue development, and people can fork it if they want to because it's open source, then I think you remove a lot of the market power problems, and then an OEM can choose whatever search engine they want, but they are not restricted from being in business because they can't get an operating system.
Well, that's the obvious implication of breaking up the tie.
Yeah, but if
Nobody
I may,
said it. Of the four of you, nobody said it. So maybe that's what you were thinking, in which case I'm doing you the favor of saying
if I may, Fiona, just to be the devil's advocate, first of all, I think that the idea of looking at this kind of a separation of Android from Google is a perfectly good idea to look at. However, what happens if the people, as we saw now with Europe, they have this new operating system that's a free Android. They use Samsung's store or Amazon's app store instead of Google. But for search, they all gravitate to Google. We're back in Luigi's world. That is not a guarantee that you will have robust competition.
It's
in
not a
search.
guarantee, but one of the things that I think would be very salutary is to say to a firm that has a lot of exclusive contracts and required default use of its product, if really what you think is that you're so good, and Steve is convinced he's going to always use Google no
completely
matter
agree with
what,
you.
why do we need a contract requiring us all
I
to use?
completely agree with you
Okay?
on that. I just
So now
don't
we have
know
a
that it
world
solves-
where if you put, so let's think about the time that the Australians threatened, that said you have to pay for news. And Google said, well, we don't want to pay for news. We're thinking we'll just leave Australia. And Microsoft said, we'd be delighted to work with the news industry in Australia. Then you have a moment where Google realizes the Australians speak English. And if 100% of them use Bing for a year or two, Bing's going to be really good. And all of a sudden, Google was back in there saying, oh, we will find a way to work with Australian news. So if Samsung or Apple decided to put a search engine as a default on their handset for 6 months, I think that would have pretty dramatic effects on what happened henceforth from that point.
Is the plan to force Apple to license iOS as well?
I didn't say that.
No, I know, exactly. I'm asking why not. So why are we picking one of the operating systems and not putting both of them?
Because we're talking about search.
But the control that applies here on the App Store is huge on both issues. So it's not clear to me why
That's a different case.
Well, yeah, I get that.
Any other questions? Yeah, Luther, go ahead.
Is there, Randy, an efficiency justification for ranking for if Google were putting its own self-preferencing its own services and you were able to test those services in the organic algorithm and learn that the Google self-preference services had a lower page rank style quality score than a third-party service, is there any kind of efficiency justification for that conduct?
So I think there's a question as to how Google monetizes the traffic it gets. It can do that through advertising. It could do it through promoting its own products. So in that situation, they should be clear about this, but I see them as promoting their own products.
I think just to piggyback on what Fiona just said, I'm not sure that the defaults destabilize the dynamic enough to where I think some of the comments earlier that the tests on ballot screens are generally about 4 and 5 are going to wind up going back into Google. Now, if you're DuckDuckGo, which is actually just built on the Bing stack, so it's really, there's like 3 stacks. It's Brave is trying to build one, Bing, and Google. If you go from 90%, 95% in Europe to a ballot screen where 1 in 5 people go for an alternative, that's not bad because if you're DuckDuckGo, you quadruple your market share overnight, and that's that I think over time could whittle away at it. I don't know if like the Australian market gives Bing enough sort of a flywheel to improve their quality. But I think if you were able to identify examples of situations where Google is self-preferencing in a way where there's really not efficiency justifications, and compel them to be interoperable with third-party services, like what Francis kind of described as middleware, I just really think is kind of interoperability. It's just taking a non-discriminatory interoperability state and saying, these are, so for Google, it's answer boxes. Anytime there's an answer box at the top of the page, there's no reason that content can't be powered in an organic way where it's selecting the best stuff from across the web as opposed to reaching into its own back pocket and putting that info up top. And I think if you do that, that does ultimately destabilize their dominance, because you have an ecosystem of nascent vertical search services that ultimately disintermediate Google, because people start saying, okay, well, I can go to this, this recipe website instead of going straight to google.com, or I can go to this local search website instead of going through google.com.
Does anyone want to comment on that or respond to that? Or no? Actually, Luther. Oh, Philip, go ahead. Go ahead if you had a question.
We spoke a bit about breakups here.
And actually, this will be the last one. So go ahead.
We spoke a bit about breakups here as like an extreme remedy, and so I wanted to prod you on possible ways of doing the breakup. So let's assume there's a problem in search, when increased competition in search, and you want to do a breakup, we decided that's the remedy. What would you do between three options, or maybe another option that you can envision? One, you fix Google as a product and say you can only do 10 links. They're blue links, that's all you can do. Second, you say you can do whatever you want, but you cannot have any kind of vertical system. So you cannot have Google Flights, you cannot have Google Shopping, everything. You can only do general search. And three, you do baby Googles. You get all the data, get all the algorithms, split in 3 companies, and say, go compete by yourselves. Let's see who wins, and if anyone wins, there's any innovation under different CEOs, different corporate controls. Would you do any of the 3? All 3? None of the 3? And why? I'm curious to understand why. Let's assume we want to increase competition in search, and there's no question about it. Theory of harm is the remedy itself.
I mean, so this idea of breaking it into 3 is this idea of possibly cloning, which is something that was discussed at some point. Rohit Chopra talked about that. I don't think that the answer is creating Moogle, Doogle, Google, Frugal, whatever. I think it seems to me hard to achieve. I like the idea of separating, whether in terms of ownership or control, parts where there are conflicts of interest, which seem to me quite clear. Indeed, situations where you have search and Android currently under the same ownership is a natural candidate. YouTube, separated from the rest, could be another candidate. I mean, you can come up with multiple solutions.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? No? I guess we will give Queen Christina the last words. Thank you all very much.